Okay, I want to thank everybody for inviting me to discuss our energy choices. President Obama says energy is one of the top 3 issues facing our country. For a heavy manufacturing state like Michigan, it's critical. It is almost impossible for people to realize the threat that foolish policy decisions would represent to the future of our economy. People are worried about their jobs, and abundant, low-cost electricity will make an enormous difference to our global economic competitiveness in the years and decades to come. Let's face it, we've had it fairly easy for the past 50 years or so compared to the rest of the world, but those days may be coming to an end. I appreciate all of you taking the time and being open to learning more about our options under these circumstances. We'll touch on economic, environmental aspects of wind, but from a high-level perspective. On a cold January morning in 2007, a man with a violin played 6 Bach pieces for about an hour in a Washington, D.C. subway station. During that time, approximately 2,000 people walked by. After 3 minutes, a middle-aged man noticed there was a musician playing. He stopped for a few seconds and then hurried to meet his schedule. A few minutes later, a woman threw $1 into the hat and walked on. 10 minutes into the performance, a 3-year-old boy stopped, but his mother tugged him along hurriedly. The child looked back at the violinist, but the mother pulled harder. After 45 minutes of continuous music, only 6 people had stopped and listened for a minute or two. About 20 made small donations, but the rest, over 1,900 of them, just continued to walk at their normal pace, never giving a second glance. At the end of an hour, the musician finished playing and left. He'd collected $32. The player was Joshua Bell, one of the greatest musicians in the world. He soloed some of the most intricate pieces ever written and on a violin worth $3.5 million. The stunt had been organized by the Washington Post newspaper, part of a social experiment about perception, taste, and people's priorities. The point is, how attentive are we really about things going on around us? This is not a game. And it's not just more of the billion-dollar petty corruption that we've always lived with. This is a multi-trillion-dollar corruption which could depress our society for the next 50 to 100 years, or worse. It truly is a life or death matter, especially for our future poor, elderly, handicapped, and for those who will be struggling to improve their condition in life. Unbelievably, our energy and environmental policies are not based on science. Policies are being chiseled by persistent lobbyists representing financial interests and political agendas, and science is being pushed aside, slandered as necessary, often drowned out entirely by the drone and pressure of political capitalism. Political capitalism is a term defined in a book by former Enron CEO, speechwriter, and energy blog host Robert Bradley Jr. Political capitalism is in contrast to what? Anybody? Political capitalism, what's the opposite of that? Anybody heard the term before? Socialism. Political capitalism actually is the opposite of free market capitalism. Political capitalism, or PC for short, means profit should be sought from taxpayers by selling to Washington and Lansing, and that private companies should focus their attention on something other than competing to provide the best value for their customers' hard-earned dollar. This is bad for us as a nation and as a state. It's bad for each ratepayer, each energy-intensive manufacturing business, and it has led us to the brink of an incomparably wasteful energy policy. So citizens, like us, must become better educated and do the necessary critical thinking. And we must share what we learn. Unless we do, current political decisions may lead to serious and irreversible consequences. I tell my kids, bad decisions sometimes lead to changes in your life that you'll want to take back. Reckless driving, drug abuse, hot dogging, texting while driving can lead to bodily harm, brain damage, even death. And time is brutally unforgiving. It moves in only one direction, and once damage is done, you can't go back. They often roll their eyes when I say these things, but making grossly bad decisions about America's energy future would be unspeakably damaging as well, in retrospect. Now, some of this material is technical, but the decision you need to make for your community's future as part of our nation's future is worth the extra time. Most of it is pretty easy to take in, so let's get started. You can go online at your convenience and go through almost all of this material at your own pace. For additional questions, please email me or the presentation's author, whose name is John Droz. His email address is available at the website where the presentation is located. Remember, I'm a consumer advocate working on this issue free of charge. I'm not selling you anything here. I'm just an inquisitive, skeptical, and concerned citizen like you. Since we're going to cover a lot of ground, you might want to write down any questions you have as we go along, and I'll answer them at the end. Perspective. The single most successful strategy in solving almost any difficult problem is to change how you look at it. So I'm strongly encouraging you to be open-minded and to look at electrical energy differently from what you've mostly seen or heard in the media. To the observer, standing below these objects, they look the same, but moving around, you discover one is a triangle and the other is diamond-shaped. So the best way to understand the differences is to change your perspective. Now, it's vital that you start with this perspective. Electricity, like bananas, is highly perishable. It's a use it or lose it proposition. The common denominators between bananas and electricity, shelf life is short. And attempts at longer-term storage don't work so well. These bananas have been refrigerated. So we buy our bananas accordingly when we want them and only when we think we'll use them. The bananas last a day or two, maybe 3 on the counter, right? Well, as Benjamin Franklin realized over 230 years ago, electricity actually vanishes in less than a second if we don't use it. Someday, mass electricity may become affordable, environmentally acceptable, and scalable to work on a large scale across our country. But until then, we have no business paying much more for much less with wind energy. So how do we handle electricity's perishability today? Our electric generators and grid systems are designed to respond to changes in demand instantaneously. Useful, practical generators are of 2 basic types. They either produce a very steady stream of power 24/7, called baseload, or they are designed to respond continuously to meet changes in demand, variable load. Changes in demand occur at our factories, our households, our businesses, our communities, all across the nation every second of every day and night. So remember, electricity is like bananas and like lightning. It doesn't keep. That's a perspective that will help you throughout this presentation. So what is critical thinking? It's a thoughtful, open-minded, logical effort to examine a claim in the light of all applicable evidence. The fact is that nothing of real value comes easily. That includes using my head. So during this thinking process, a key scientific ingredient to keep on hand is a healthy dose of skepticism. Famous scientist Carl Sagan said, "Skeptical scrutiny is the means by which deep thoughts can be separated from deep nonsense." Critical thinking is in contrast to groupthink, which is defined as a behavior exhibited by group members who adhere to consensus at the expense of critically testing, analyzing, and evaluating ideas. In my opinion, this is what is going on with most leading environmental groups today, and unfortunately, with many of our elected representatives as well. This Thomas Paine quote says a lot. When men give up the privilege of thinking, the last shadow of liberty leaves the horizon. So today I'm wearing 3 different hats. Number 1, I'm representing a physicist who is used to investigating complex issues like wind power. Secondly, I'm representing the knowledge of many accomplished economists, including John Droz, who retired at age 34 due to his ability to think his way through investment opportunities and risks. And thirdly, I'm representing an environmental activist. Mr. Droz has worked on a variety of environmental issues for over 25 years, like improving surface and groundwater quality standards in New York State. I also have a passion for environmental stewardship and a deep love and desire to preserve unspoiled places on our Earth. When I first heard about wind energy, I was a supporter. Quite frankly, I never liked the looks and dominating size of the turbines, but conceded we would just have to live with them as a trade-off for the good I assumed they were doing. Then I did some research and critical thinking. My conclusion now is that we can live cleaner, more efficiently, more frugally, more responsibly without them. Without the cost, without the performance flaws and inefficiencies they impose, without the repetition, the massive land use, the redundancy, and the unnatural mechanized enormity against open skies. And no, there are no wind power developments proposed for my community, so this is not a NIMBY matter for me. I am here sharing what I believe is in the best interest of our country. That's it. Wind fails to deliver the goods. What do I mean by that? Well, I mean that wind power is not a technically sound or independent source of electrical capacity. We'll dig into the term capacity later. Wind power is not an economically viable source of energy on its own without massive subsidies. And number 3, wind power is not environmentally responsible for several reasons. These 3 criteria have not been selected to make wind power look bad. They are what must be used to evaluate the legitimacy of any new source of energy. So we'll maintain allegiance to the scientific method, asking, have the proponents done a complete analysis of all of the direct and indirect considerations of adding their product, wind energy, to our energy mix? Until there's solid, irrefutable proof they have, and their proposed solution is a clear winner, we shouldn't be paying for it as taxpayers. But we have business persons, lobbyists, investors, opportunists, proposing that wind power be an integral part of our energy policy. So the ball is in their court to provide comprehensive, independent, objective, transparent, empirical proof that wind power is a viable solution from all pertinent perspectives. This is extremely important and must be carried out using the scientific method. I can fully appreciate that cash-strapped communities are interested when a developer steps forward offering attractive financial inducements. Sure, wind power is a business that will bring money to the area. But can we step back from our own local drama for a while here? Michigan has led change in America before. I'm talking about the development of the automobile. You've all seen the true value of personal transportation in our society, right? So you know true value, you know a good, valuable technology when you see one and can pick it out of a lineup, right? That's good. Most communities have some type of regulation for the location and size of signs allowable. Why? To minimize visual pollution. Sometimes preserving the nature and character of a community takes precedence over commercialization of that community. Sometimes preserving the nature and character of a community takes precedence over commercialization of that community. But let's say a big foreign company comes to town and says, we have a great new business opportunity. We want to use your area to display some beautiful new billboards. These are called megaboards. They're about 450 to 500 feet high, And we'd like to build 250 or so of them in and around your county. And we'll arrange it so that your town will make good money from these through some arrangements similar to taxes, but instead of taxes. Yeah. Unless you say yes, we can guarantee you no mega board jobs will be coming to this area anytime soon. You do want jobs around here, don't you? And on it would go. So would your community rush out to change their sign ordinance to get this money? Maybe. Even though there'd be profits made by people leasing land to these advertisers and money going to the town, I'd like to believe that most sensible people would be against such blatant commercialization of their community. Now, I don't believe everything should be for sale. Some things represent fundamental parts of our quality of life and should not be sold for any price. For another thing, I believe in shared values, and what one individual does with his property can and often does impact his neighbors and community. Okay, time to get to the nitty-gritty here. When we buy things that don't work as promised, how do we feel? Not very good, right? Angry, ripped off. So don't we usually try to get a feeling of proof that something's going to work as promised before we hand our money across the checkout counter to buy some new gizmo? An article in Mother Earth News made some amazing claims in support of wind power. So John decided to contact the writer, who was a well-known and reportedly competent individual. John's question to him was, what independent scientific information do you have that proves wind power does what it's supposed to do? After several amusingly evasive correspondences, the writer eventually conceded that he had none. And then, in a desperate attempt to try to defend his untenable position, he said, no proof was needed that wind power does what it promises to do. It's fascinating to see people's reaction when they're presented with facts that run contrary to their beliefs. John Kenneth Galbraith put it this way: the conventional view serves to protect us from the painful job of thinking. The official psychological explanation for this is called cognitive dissonance. People tend to get into a mindset and it becomes extremely difficult for them to change their position. Some of you may remember the UFO fears of the 1950s, and many people still cling to this fear today. So what about global warming? Is that a scientific threat? It's kind of a trick question. It's a threat made by some scientists. Let me answer further by reading these slides. Is every priest a holy person? Is every lawyer a law-abiding citizen? Is every scientist a promoter of science? Just because a scientist makes an assertion does not make that claim scientific. There are thousands of scientists who have personal or political agendas to promote. So what makes a claim scientific is that it has been subjected to the scientific method. The first practical use, the scientific method consists of a comprehensive, independent, objective, transparent, and empirical-based assessment of claims made by proponents. Anything less is not real science. Okay, the first practical use of electricity is generally attributed to Thomas Edison, a founder of General Electric Company. Now, many people were involved, of course, and there were a lot of formidable hurdles to overcome. One of the initial key decisions was, where is this electricity going to come from? Well, beginning then, and for the next 100+ years, there were 6 principal requirements adopted for commercial electricity generators. First, that they provide large amounts of electricity, that they provide reliable and predictable electricity, that they provide dispatchable electricity, that they service one or more grid demand elements, and their facility be compact. Finally, they needed to be able to provide economical electricity. These became the basis for what developed into the most successful grid system on the planet. And our reliable grids and affordable electricity rates have a lot to do with our country's economic success. Several options were put forward as potential sources of electricity, and each idea was vetted. The sources that prevailed, as it turns out, complied with all 6 of these conditions. Over time, we have come to rely on the following sources to provide commercial electricity for us: coal, nuclear, natural gas, hydro, and oil. Now, I've added renewables to give you some perspective here. But oil is by far the smallest conventional source. 1% of U.S. electricity comes from oil. We export much more oil than we use for electricity. Export. Note that each of these meets not some, but all of the 6 essential requirements. And if that changes, like oil now, if it's more expensive, then they get replaced by sources that do meet all 6. Notice that's how natural markets work when left to progress and unfold on their own. These conventional sources, or some subset of them, can provide all of the electricity needs of our society and continue to meet all 6 criteria for many, many generations, even centuries. Note also that there is essentially no foreign dependence for any of these. In other words, we have always been energy independent here when speaking of electricity sources. So, what's the problem? Well, a new element has been added to the list of 6 requirements for electrical power sources: environmental impact. And the current number 1 environmental impact consideration is greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide. So why has this joined the big 6 in such a big way recently? The debate on global warming. Note the word debate. This is not yet a scientifically resolved matter, though some would like to have you believe that it is. Note also that climate change and global warming are very different things. It is scientifically accepted that we've had some unusual climate experiences. Global warming, on the other hand, is a hypothesis or a theory that offers one explanation for these changes, that these are primarily due to man-made carbon dioxide emissions. That is the part that's not scientifically proven. But unfortunately for wind power, whether you believe in the global warming theory or not, the conclusion is still the same. Wind power doesn't deliver the goods. But for better or worse, in sickness or in health, in response to intense political pressure from lobbyists, our government has acquiesced to make carbon emissions an additional criterion. Some say that we should follow the precautionary principle. Since global warming is a scary unknown, we should try to reverse it before it's too late, just in case it's true. But if we are really concerned about being safe, then we should want objective, measured proof that our money, efforts, and sacrifices are producing consequential benefits, right? No such proof exists for wind power, not for replacing fossil fuels, and not for cooling the planet. So having governments step into the utility business and mandate that they must change the principles that have been the foundation of our electrical supply system since the 1800s is unsettling. Transforming a successful system based on a climate-related hypothesis that is not yet scientifically resolved makes it worse. But what tops these concerns is that this new standard for electrical supply sources now has taken priority over all the other 6. In this unraveling of sensibility, there is one final incredible insult to science. Alternative electrical power sources that claim to meet this new super criteria to make a consequential impact on carbon dioxide don't even have to prove that they accomplish the goal. And we'll talk about this a little later. So let's examine each of the 6 historical criteria for our environmental poster child, wind power, and then the new one about global warming emissions. Number 1, does wind energy provide large amounts of electricity? Well, perhaps it could. However, its effectiveness from most perspectives is second-rate. For instance, because of the wide and unpredictable fluctuations of wind, the devices only produce, on average, about 30% of their nameplate power, probably 25% here in Lenawee County. This shortfall in dependability is made worse by the fact that there is no way to economically and environmentally store large amounts of electricity for later use. Remember the bananas. Another example of its dilutedness compared to a nuclear reactor, it takes over 1,000 times the amount of land for wind power to produce a roughly equivalent amount of energy. 1,000 times the amount of land in a project zone. So, number 2, does wind energy produce reliable and predictable electricity? No. Despite the wind industry's claims, it is not reliable or predictable compared to the standards of our other conventional electrical sources. And unlike conventional sources, wind energy projects don't have to pass performance reliability tests. Why? Because unreliability is a given. A wind turbine's output skitters continuously between 0 and 100% of its rated power and is extremely sensitive to small changes in wind speed. What's worse is that when the largest amounts of power are needed, for example, hot summer afternoons, the wind is most often at a standstill. It is mostly available at night when demand is lowest, and in the spring and fall, our lowest demand seasons of the year, because heating and air conditioning needs are small then. This negative correlation to demand has serious implications that we'll discuss in a few minutes. These charts tell an important story. They're both from the German grid manager E.ON Netz. E.ON Netz was an early adopter of widely distributed wind projects and a true pioneer in incorporating a lot of wind into a grid system. The table on the right shows the forecast wind energy an hour in advance, in this column here, the third column, and then the actual wind energy production for those forecast periods in this column over here. I know you can't read this in the back, so I'll point out a couple of the data points here. The data are 15 minutes apart and run for 6 consecutive hours. Now, the wind lobby and developers tell us that forecasting is good and getting better all the time. Well, please take a look at this information for yourself. It's available at eon-nets.com. Note that in the beginning, the power produced is about half what was expected. Forecast was 158 megawatts, actual was 83. At the end of the short time period here, it's completely reversed. Output is 478, forecast was only 264. Observe the extremely wide variability across just this 6-hour span. Note also that at no time did the output equal the prediction. Now, another perspective is in the red graph on the left. This shows the total daily wind power for the entire year. This should give you another inkling of the enormous variability of wind power and how difficult, aka expensive, it is to integrate into the grid. Okay, does wind power provide dispatchable electricity? No. Due to its unpredictability, wind cannot be counted on to provide power on demand on a human-defined schedule. That should be obvious from the chart on the previous slide. Is this unsteady, weak performance taken into account by laws that attempt to encourage the use of wind energy? No. Rather than abandon this second-rate power source, the government's solution is to A, subsidize wind energy to make up for its high cost and low value, B, pass laws to make it illegal not to buy it, and C, change consumer habits to conform to wind's whims. This is one of the major goals of smart grids and demand response initiatives such as time-of-use pricing. Time-of-use pricing essentially seeks to charge customers more for electricity when they need it the most. Imposing electricity limits on Americans is the project, and these are the tools of the trade. Does wind power provide one or more of the grid demand elements? No. The brief answer is it does not truly provide base load or load following. Remember the bananas, and that there is no viable storage scheme for electrical energy on a grid scale. Remember that supply and demand must be balanced every second. Since this is an important issue, we'll look at it a bit closer. Here is a 15-day demand profile from September. We'll split it into two categories. The first type of user demand is called base load. This is the predictable underlying electricity requirement needed 24/7, 365. Note that it is providing a steady 29 gigawatts of power. Can wind displace this? Well, not as a standalone contributor, and that's important. The main baseload sources of electrical power are nuclear and large coal facilities. Coal facilities emit 85% of the electricity sector's carbon dioxide. But since wind energy can't provide baseload power alone, it will not independently replace any baseload coal generation. On the other hand, nuclear facilities can and do provide baseload and emit almost no carbon dioxide. New nuclear facilities, then, would replace existing high-emitting coal facilities, or could be built instead of new coal facilities. The second type of demand is called load following. This part of demand goes up and down each day on a fairly predictable cycle. But even with predictability, it should be noted that it costs much more to fill variable demand than baseload demand per unit of energy supplied. So, can wind fill or reliably contribute to this cyclical part of demand? Well, no, because wind speeds don't follow the same pattern as demand. In fact, wind output is negatively correlated to demand patterns. Variable load is primarily served by natural gas, hydro, and smaller coal facilities. It is more expensive energy for several reasons, including the fact that accelerating and decelerating these plants, or turning them on and off repeatedly, increases maintenance costs and lowers fuel efficiency. As this slide suggests, a good analogy for variable load is city driving, and base load is the cruise control highway driving. An important thing to remember is that when wind replaces hydro, there are zero carbon dioxide savings. And when wind replaces natural gas or coal, there are only tiny carbon dioxide savings. So let's look at that last point more closely. Here again is our 15-day demand profile. As it turns out, wind is a player in this market, which happens to be Southeast Australia. We can talk about why I chose this data in a little bit. Wind's generating pattern is shown here in red. But does it replace baseload, where I've shown it overlaid over the baseload portion, or does it displace variable load? Well, to figure that out, we need to first see how the wind affects variability on the system. We can see here that it adds to variability. So let's move it up onto the variable supply curve. Instead of extending it from the bottom, we're going to extend it down from the top of demand. I did this in Excel. The data is available along with the charts if anybody would like a copy of it. It's a little, not quite intuitive, but watch closely as these slides change. I can go back and forth a couple times. That's the exact same wind pattern shown from the top down. So demand is represented by both the red and blue areas, and wind energy there is the red area filling what it can of demand. Okay, I'll go back and forth here. between those two one more time. You can see there are basically 5 large peaks of wind here. They correspond with these 5 valleys when you come from the top down. Okay, so the blue portion, okay, represents what's left of demand after wind has contributed what it can contribute. Okay? That's what our conventional generators must fill after wind energy does its part. And we've rightly taken the wind up to the top here because baseload generators are designed to run continuously at a steady output. And they could never get out of the way fast enough when the wind picks up and then be brought back online each time it calms. Okay, like I said, the blue part is the demand left for the conventional generators to fill. Since wind is filling the part of demand now shaded red. Okay, does everybody understand where we are at this point? Was that confusing? It's a little difficult to represent. Okay, I'll go on. So now we're going to erase the red part so we can concentrate on what's left for our conventional generators to deal with. But what happened here? Look at the baseload portion in dark blue. Notice it's now at approximately 10 gigawatts. It was at 29. With perfect wind forecasts, we could turn the big coal plants up and back over a few-day period. That's how quickly they move around. But wind forecasting is not perfect, and especially not over a day or two ahead of time. So with perfect wind forecasting, if we knew there wasn't going to be much wind in these 3 days, we could start to ramp coal plants up in here and fill in some of this variable load with base load. That would also come with some costs as far as the fuel consumption per unit of energy. So let's go back and forth here. There was base load and variable load without wind. Here it is with wind. You can notice several things have happened. The amplitude of the daily waveforms here has increased with wind. Okay? So the distance from the peaks to the valleys that have to be filled by our variable load conventional resources has increased. You can also see that the slopes of these angles have gotten steeper. So that means our variable load resources have to react faster, accelerate, decelerate quicker. Okay? And finally, you can see that there are a few more peaks and valleys and irregularity, oops, went the wrong way, between your daily demand cycles and your cycles with wind. Notice that with wind, there is actually more inefficient, expensive, fuel-intensive variable generation required, not less, than without any wind. And that variable generation has even more stop-and-go traffic to deal with and has to drive more aggressively than without wind. Notice also the height of the variability wave is taller. And steeper than without wind. All of this adds cost that the wind industry doesn't claim as their own. But more importantly, that is picked up by ratepayers. Just great. Another way we get to pay for wind energy. So the baseload demand has been lowered by 19 gigawatts, from 29 gigawatts to 10. And the wind adds up to an average of about 9 gigawatts in this example. I have the actual data, and I'm happy to share it. That means the variable load resources, small coal, gas, and a small fraction from hydro, have increased by around 10 gigawatts. This makes sense since the wind fraction in Southeast Australia runs about 40% annual capacity factor over time. So to answer our question, does wind displace variable load or base load? Well, what's the answer? It's not very clear, is it? Well, it does replace base load. Base load was 29, now it's 10. But wind didn't do it by itself. 9 gigawatts of wind was added with 10 gigawatts of variable load sources to replace the 19 gigawatts of base load. So no, variable load sources kicked in the other 10 gigawatts. So this slide represents the wind energy again as contributing to reducing base load. And the additional small coal, gas, and hydro are in the lightest blue section, entangled with the wind, to make a stable product totaling 19 gigawatts that finally replaces the base load. Unfortunately, none of these slides are quite real world because of the reverse Dutch auctions for power on grids and many other factors too complicated for today, including importing and exporting between grid regions and a number of other rules in our electric system grid operators. But from a physics standpoint, this is what ultimately must play out when significant amounts of wind, in this example about 20% of all electricity, are imposed on grids. So we replaced some fuel-efficient base load with a mixture of wind plus less efficiently burning coal or natural gas. Catch this point. We reduced the electricity from fossil fuels, but we burned the remaining fossil fuels less efficiently to do so. As my friend George Taylor surmised, the real question here should never have been how much electricity wind can generate, but rather how much fossil fuel and emissions that wind could save. These are two very different questions with very different answers. The main reasons for these low savings is due to what's called thermal inefficiencies, which means that the gas or small coal units are operating very inefficiently, ramping up and down and at less than optimal speeds, just like your car does in stop-and-go traffic. One last point here. Notice the very poor match between wind and demand. The match is not good at all, but all conventional sources are matched to demand. And that is the underlying meaning of a term called capacity value. Capacity value is the ability to rapidly convert a set amount of energy at specified convenient times. Okay, that's what capacity value is. That term may come up again later. So, for instance, with a nuclear facility, a grid operator has nearly 100% confidence that nearly full power, actually in the summertime about 92 or 93%, will be available from that facility at the times of greatest demand. Coal and nuclear plants also suffer from the weather, a very small amount, because the hotter the temperature is outside, the lower the difference in temperature between the combustion going on inside in the steam cycle and the ambient temperature. And the bigger that temperature difference is, the colder it is outside, the more efficient the burning of the fuel becomes to convert it to electricity. So where on your coldest winter days, a coal and nuclear plant can operate at 100% of its rated capacity. On the hottest day of summer, it's down for nuclear around 92 or 93%. Just thought I'd bring that up to be fair, because there is some variability according to the weather with nuclear as well. But that 92 or 93% is straight out flatline, full, even baseload capacity.